Welcome to The Buck Starts Here, the podcast that digs deep into the juicy stories, power plays, and wild twists that shape the presidencies of the United States. I am Kyle, your casual history connoisseur, and I'm joined by Eric Mason, who moonlights as one of Boston's top economists when he's not spilling incredulous facts about our founding fathers. This week we're on to James Madison. I'm guessing we're getting to the edges of what's commonly known about our founding fathers. I've heard of Madison. I know there's a war with Britain somewhere in here. But other than that, I don't think I know much else about our fourth president.
Fortunately, I think for me is that that's true with most people.
Right.
And Madison is just a really, really interesting character.
Are we getting into the presidents now that are a lot more documented than maybe some of the previous ones? Okay.
Yeah, I mean, James Madison died he lived to be 85.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so he was born in the 1750s. He's kind of the last founding father that we're not going to have. Him and Monroe are their last gap. And then you get to John Quincy Adams, whose whole life is documented.
Mm-hmm.
Jackson, very similarly. And then once you have that, then there's almost an art of preserving that type of information.
Right.
Then we'll start getting really fun because we have even more obscure stories.
Well, once you get to like the 7th or 8th president, you kind of realize that the experiment is maybe going to work out, and you should probably start preserving some of this stuff.
You're like, whoa, hold on a minute.
Yeah.
And then William Henry Harrison dies after 31 days. Chairman William. I think he was the oldest president elected at the time. They should have saw that coming.
Right.
We don't skip too far ahead. So without further ado,
electing 80-year-olds in the 1800s. I'm sorry.
Yeah, right. James Madison, founding father, fourth president, and the guy who had the absolute worst day at the office when the British marched into Washington, D.C. and set the White House on fire.
Yeah, that was a bad day.
Frowned upon. His presidency was a wild ride, marked by war, economic shakeups, the constant struggle to keep a young nation from falling apart. Madison stepped into the presidency in 1809, following the footsteps of his BFF, Thomas Jefferson. He ran on a platform of keeping the Democratic-Republican dream alive, small government, strong national defense, and boosting both farming and industry, so America wasn't forever at the mercy of Britain and France's very messy drama. Hundreds and hundreds of years messy drama.
Years.
Spoiler.
Centuries.
Spoiler, that didn't go exactly as planned. His time in office was a roller coaster. The War of 1812 broke out, which some people called America's second war of independence, and others called maybe let's not fight the British again, or my favorite one, Mr. Madison's War.
Really? Is that what they called it?
Yeah, the people up in New England called it that. The nation barely scraped through, but not before D.C. went up in flames and Madison had to flee his own house. Dolly Madison, however, absolute legend, she saved George Washington's portrait like a badass. Though there's some controversy to that we'll get into.
Ooh,
yes.
Okay.
Ooh, teaser. But it wasn't all fires and foreign wars. Madison eventually helped stabilize the economy with the founding of the Second Bank of the U.S., pushed for infrastructure improvements to connect a growing nation, though he never actually followed through with the bonus bill.
No,
he never did. Again, we'll get into the very interesting life of Mr. Madison. And even threw in some tariffs to protect American businesses. Sounds familiar?
Yeah, a little bit.
And once the war dust settled, we got the so-called era of good feelings. Basically a brief period where Americans weren't at each other's throats for once. So, was Madison a genius? A wartime disaster? Both? Let's dive in and figure out who made this founding father, what made this founding father tick? All right, so where to begin? He is, like you said, he's usually the first. He's either the president, the last president people know about a lot about, or the first president people don't know about. That's usually a good way to describe Mr. Madison. So, like I mentioned a little bit in the beginning, is that Madison lived to be 85. So we have an insane amount of Madison's personal accounts. In fact, Madison held off on even selling his papers of his letters that he kept when he drafted the Constitution. He held off on selling them to Congress. He actually held out to get like the best price possible.
Why?
Why did he hold off on selling them?
Because he was poor?
Yeah. He was horrible financial straits. Which is actually, Jefferson just spent a bunch of money. Washington never really, he had like some financial type, but not really. As we talked about, Adams had Abigail, who was just a financial genius. James Madison had a stepson from Dolly's first marriage, who was a gambler and a drunk who kept needing money to get bailed out of stuff. These are real people. They have bad things that happen to them. I don't think that gets covered in most history classes. Like, hey, yeah. By the way, Dolly's kid she brought to the relationship gambled a lot.
What was his son's name?
John Payne Todd.
John Payne Todd. Payne.
Yes, sir.
All right, yeah, we're gonna have to dive into that one a little bit deeper. I think.
I've done some homework on that one. Maybe in one of the later episodes, but it is interesting. Also, huge age gap between Dolly and James Madison. So James was 43 when he got married. Dolly was 26.
This was his first marriage too, right?
Yeah. So he's only married once and never had any kids. So there's no heirs to the Madison estate.
Oh, really? Do you know why?
I don't really know why. So it's important to remember, of the 4 founding fathers, only one had a son. Oh, a legitimate son. Oh. Jefferson, you always have to do that. He should be the asterisk president. So Washington didn't have kids. He had some stepchildren. John Quincy Adams, and there's a couple other Adams siblings that I'm blanking on right now, which is really embarrassing me for Quincy. Jefferson had a couple kids, had a couple sons, but they were illegitimate. They were Sally Hemings. He had 2 daughters. Madison didn't have any kids. So,
do you think he might have been gay?
No, all the letters seemed a very loving and affectionate relationship. I mean, it's hard to tell. It was 200 years ago, so like, I know you hear stuff about like James Buchanan, because I think he was only bachelor, the only president who was a bachelor his entire time, and I believe Benjamin Harrison got married in office, if I remember correctly. Which is gonna be weird dating the president. That's gotta feel made up, right?
Yeah, there's a whole movie on that, isn't there, with Michael Douglas?
I didn't know that. I always think of the early Disney Channel Anne Hathaway movie, My Date with the President's Daughter. Is that Anne Hathaway?
The American President. That's one of my mom's favorite movies. You've never heard of that one?
No, I've never heard of that.
God, you know how many times I've seen that just because anytime it was on, she would watch it.
Oh, I'm sorry. It's not Anne Hathaway. It's Elizabeth Harnos. Harnois. My Date with the President's Daughter. No, but they have a very loving marriage. Like, a lot of the letters are, what do you call it? A lot of the letters are very loving. They are seen in public as, Madison was a very shy, reserved person, even from childhood. But even in public, they were seen like Dolly was the only person getting out of his shell. So they from all our viewpoints we have, they had a loving marriage. But again, never forget, just because something's a primary source does not mean it's an accurate source. People back then, wrote things that may not have been accurate at the time.
Yeah, there's a newspaper that called John Adams a hermaphrodite. So we know that not everything was accurate.
Agreed. So James, we have another. Was born March 16th, 1751, which is our second near St. Patrick's Day reference in a couple episodes. In Port Conway, Virginia, he was born at his grandmother's house. His dad was James Madison Sr. His mom was Nellie Conway Madison, and they were the elite of Virginia. Like both families, the Conway and the it was called Port Conway, Virginia.
Right, yeah.
Yeah, so wealthy you have to name the area after your family.
Not just in any area, but also a port town.
A port town. And I say that as somebody who's from Quincy, which is named after an incredibly wealthy family.
Right.
So, I'm not throwing any shade at Port Conway, Virginia. I hope we have no listeners down there who will take offense to me saying that. I'm on your team. So they were crazy high aristocrats. Like, they were the upper echelon. I probably would put them maybe even above Jefferson's family. They're probably on par with Martha Washington. Yeah, I think Martha Washington was like the wealthiest woman in Virginia at the time, or was from there. So think of like the 1% of the 1%.
This is like the tobacco plantation owner.
So he was tobacco, yeah.
Yeah.
I think the Conway farm also did some corn and rice and maybe indigo, but mostly tobacco, which would actually later come on and spell the doom for Madison's wealth as tobacco farming moved further south to the Caribbean, would eventually leave him destitute. A lot of people say that's the reason he didn't free his slaves during his lifetime.
Yeah, that seems to be a common theme, huh?
Yeah, Dolly did eventually take over the estate, but she actually ended up in 1844 selling a bunch of the slaves. And it was really sad because it broke up a lot of families, which Madison was against doing. Now, unlike Jefferson, Madison throughout his whole life openly acknowledged the hypocrisy of drafting the Constitution and still having slaves. He is not a Jefferson in that he says one thing out of one side of his mouth and does something different. Madison openly struggled with this. Madison, from a very young age, so probably right about the time he got into politics, around 29 years old, he openly discussed it, openly talked with people saying, we need to solve this. And
Can I just, real quick, did Abigail have anything to do with that? Did she, call him out at a dinner party one day and, put the seed in his head?
They wouldn't have met yet, but I'm sure Abigail gave Madison the business at some point. Probably brought James with but what do you think, Mr. Madison?
Yes.
So he openly talked about it. He viewed slavery, actually, ironically, he was best friends with Jefferson. Jefferson was his mentor. Madison was Jefferson's protege. Madison thought slavery would cause a civil war. He was very open about that from I'm going to say mid 1770s, but late 1770s, early 1780s. He was openly already talking about that this is going to cause a civil war. This is the systems can't relate. No. As we'll talk more about, but Madison advocated for the founding of Liberia, which is an African, it's now an African country. It's the flag everybody, if you're doing your emojis, some people make the U.S. flag. They think it's the U.S. flag. It's the U.S. flag, but the blue field only has one star on it. W.E. Du Bois was also wrote a lot about that, if everybody remembers that from their literature classes. He believed that in order that slavery could only end if, slaves were expatriated. I wouldn't say expatriated because a lot of slaves didn't come from West Africa, so I think that's a very reductionist view of the issue.
Kind of it makes sense if you're sending them back the first generation, but once they've been here for a couple generations, no, they're Americans now at this point. They don't know anybody back in Africa. You can't just no, that's not going to work.
And even though a lot of slaves are traded on the slave coast, many slaves came from sub-Saharan Africa, so they were captured by other groups and brought to the coast to be sold for slavery into slavery. So they're not even from Liberia, where Liberia is geographically.
Exactly.
Who would have guessed there was a lot of racism involved in slavery? I would have never thought of that.
The sad thing is, he was probably seen as a progressive.
He kind of was.
Yeah.
But we know a lot about Madison's how he treated his slaves because, again, this is in probably next episode. But Madison brought slaves to the White House also, but he was there was a slave who bought his freedom and eventually wrote a book about what it was like to work for James Madison. And he writes, he viewed Mr. Madison as, always never raised a hand, didn't believe in violence, and he said he felt treated well, but he's still a slave. He's I wasn't treated as an equal, all these bad things. I mean, I certainly don't want to sound like this is an argument for paternalism, but it was, Madison was a man who did not shy away from the controversy that what he was doing was inherently hypocrisy, and it wrenched him. He did not know how to reconcile this. It wasn't like he was ignoring the outcomes of this. He genuinely, it sounds like from a lot of his writings and a lot of his talking, really struggled with the idea of how slavery was going to essentially destroy the Constitution he wrote. Mm-hmm. And in fairness, it almost did.
It wasn't wrong.
Yeah, you saw it. But but he unlike Jefferson, there isn't this blindness to what you're saying versus what you're doing. He advocated for gradual abolition, which is dumb. Don't get me wrong. wait till your great-great-grandkid may not be a slave his whole life. No, that doesn't work either. Come on. But, so Madison's born to this family. His family owns about 100 slaves, and they own a large tobacco farm. They own, it was very what you would think of kind of stereotypical plantation life at that time for a young aristocrat. But something that never really gets talked about Madison. Madison, but most historians believe had epilepsy. He was he was a very, very sick child. They thought he wasn't going to survive. He was born incredibly small. He had poor health. He became a homebody. He never really worked out on the plantation. He never really left the house and played in physical activities. He wasn't, 6'2" Jefferson or 6'2", 6'3" Washington. He wasn't, plump Mr. Adams. He was frail. He was tiny. And he had bouts of epileptic seizures as, he suffered from very severe depression and anxiety. He had a ton of anxiety throughout his entire life. Not that anxiety ever fully wanes, but it really was when he married Dolly, that his anxiety became more under control. And it was often said that one of the reasons that Madison began to flourish as a national leader and as a national politician is that Dolly took a lot of the attention off of him at parties. And Dolly was this crazy charismatic lady.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, so Dolly was she was crazy charismatic. She was really what the first lady, in a sense that she believed in hosting. Where Abigail Adams hosted like the first parties and stuff at the White House, and the idea of being the hostess of the nation. Well, Dolly was the first one to be like the hostess with the mostest, right? Like she was the first one to throw parties and establish social circles and all that stuff. She was just, she was one of the best things, if not the best thing to ever happen to him.
How did somebody like him even get elected president then? This does not sound like the person that you want leading your country. Frail, little, sickly.
Yeah, when he was
nervous.
Yeah, right. When he was elected, after he rode a horse to his inauguration, but it was like a small pony.
Yeah.
And so they were like, "Oh, little Madison on his little pony" was like one of the headlines of a local newspaper. This is a cool thing. There's a lot of great historical publications. They'll actually go back and look at famous historical figures and try and figure out what was the matter with them, health wise.
Right.
They also think he suffered from TIAs, from mini strokes.
TIAs? What's that?
It's like a mini stroke.
Okay. Well, if he had epilepsy, that would be like seizures too, right?
Yep. He also so he was known for sometimes just going silent. And not being able to really talk or convey information. But make no mistake, James Madison was one of the most intelligent human beings on the face of the earth at the time. Not in the United States, not in the Western world, probably in the entire globe. His education was unrivaled. And he was not educated just in law, which a lot of the founding fathers were. He was educated in everything. He spoke Greek, he spoke Latin. He would translate both to each one and then write in English. He received his education from a young age because he couldn't go out and play. He was taught to read at a very young age. He had a personal tutor, a Donald Robertson, who was a Scottish schoolmaster. You probably know
Scotland sending so many enlightened people over here to teach our kids.
Yeah, I was going to say, you guys probably noticing that. There's a couple different reasons. There's a lot of Presbyterianism in Scotland, and religion and education are tied pretty close together right now. So a lot of aristocratic families wanted that type of.
If I was going to call my English friends or my friends that live over in Britain, I was going to ask you who are the most enlightened people in your country. I don't think that Scotland's going to be the answer I get. No offense, Scotland.
Scottish viewership plummets.
Look, the last Scottish guy I worked with, he had a tendency to spit on you when he got angry.
Honestly, kind of a fan.
Yeah.
He won every argument. I had to leave.
You're either getting spit on, or his shoulder was always popping like he was going to throw a punch.
Hey, they were never conquered. Give them credit. So, Donald Robertson came in. Donald Robertson, he was a really cool guy. So he was a schoolmaster. He's considered like one of the guys who introduced like the idea of classical education in the United States. So they sent him around 11. He was so he learned Latin and Greek. He also learned mathematics. So he was brilliant in arithmetic, but also geometry and algebra. He took Robertson really also focused on the emphasis of government structures in Rome and Greece.
Oh, that's probably a good move, yeah. Okay.
Probably a good move for the guy who will eventually write our Constitution. And one of my favorite things is Madison was a little bit of a geography junkie.
Oh, yeah?
He loved geography. He loved he had his brain really worked in that way. How much did Robertson matter? In one of Madison's later in life, he wrote, not like a memoir, but basically like a collection of letters. That he said, this is talking about Donald Robertson. All that I have been in life, I owe largely to this man. Robertson, Robinson also focused very heavily on teaching the ideas of Republican government, which you could see why a young Madison would eventually use that a lot.
Like Plato's Republic?
Like Roman Republic.
Oh, okay.
And then the other tutor that was, so the tutor took over for a couple of years after Donald Robertson as Madison got older, was this guy, Reverend Tom Martin. He was an Anglican clergyman. He was from Ireland. So he was actually a really, really interesting dude. So very obviously very well educated. Not nearly as well educated as Donald Robertson, but he was this like crazy devout moralist. And I think this is probably where a lot of Madison's views on the hypocrisy of slavery have come about.
Yeah,
because Reverend Martin, he kind of ended the classical education that Madison was having. He still taught the classical education, but he heavily injected philosophy and theology. The idea of like ethics, logic, huge things on political theory. Reverend Martin was obsessed with John Locke. Really, really, really obsessed with John Locke. And if you want to see we don't have a lot of direct quotes on Madison's opinion of Reverend Martin. I think we have something a little better. Everybody thought, all the elite at the time went to the College of William and Mary. That's where Jefferson went. That's where all these people, super famous people went. But Reverend Martin was involved with a college called the College of New Jersey, which is Princeton. We now call that Princeton. Okay. And that's where he went. He ended up going to Princeton. He was at Princeton for, obviously, got his education.
Before Princeton became, Princeton? Was this before it was prestigious?
No, it's still crazy prestigious right now. Yeah. I feel like College of New Jersey makes it sound like it's a state school.
Anything New Jersey just makes it sound not good.
Rutgers is really resistant to putting their address on stuff. The other funny thing, I think this is wicked funny. I don't know. So I'm just going to say it. His parents didn't want him to go to William and Mary because they had a reputation. I want to quote this: a reputation of lax moral environment.
William and Mary had that, not them.
Yeah.
Not Madison's family.
No, Madison's family.
No.
Well, I mean, they had slaves. They had slaves, so they probably had a pretty lax moral viewpoint. No, and I do find that funny because if you told somebody right now who goes to William and Mary College, which is actually that's a public university, which is very interesting.
Laura's sister worked there for years.
Yeah, it obviously, I went to WVU, which has a different reputation. I would not consider, if somebody went to school at the College of William and Mary, I'd be like, oh, you have lacked morals. Which I may start saying that to people.
I know, I'm going to tell Laura's sister.
I'm sorry, do you disagree with the fourth president of the United States about your lax morals? Yeah. And we have, Madison was a good example of just where education takes you, despite being so sickly. And here's the thing, he never got healthy his entire life. I want to be clear. He never was healthy as president. He lived to be 85, but the last few... last few years he had to be carried up and down stairs and stuff. I mean, like, I find Madison's story so interesting because he's just such a. We all know, like, everybody knows the big facts of his presidency. Everybody knows that they like, the War of 1812, and yeah, he was friends with Jefferson, and he was short as president, which is stupid. He wasn't that short. Like, it was like, he's 5'2". It's like, yeah, the average person's like 5'4", man. Like, yeah. So it was very rigorous at Princeton. President John Witherspoon kept a very, very rigorous academic schedule. Kind of made Princeton into what it is today. Mm-hmm. And this really shaped Madison. Really, really shaped him. And Madison ends up, taking these ideas and pushing them forward as he began to develop his view on government, his view on the world. And, Madison's just so interesting because he's this man who fully sees the hypocrisy of being a slaveholder and is trying in his best educated mind to solve that solution in the best way he thinks he can. So he doesn't carry that same, hypocrisy that Jefferson carries. Then you mix in the fact that he has all this moral philosophy.
It's not the same, but it's also not. It's still. He still kept him.
Oh yeah, it was crappy. It's still really crappy. It's just not hypocritical, I would say.
It's less hypocritical.
It's
but
less
I think
hypocritical.
It still is a little bit.
Yeah. I just have a weird thing with the whole all men are created equal. And then, explicitly not having all men created equal. It feels like a weird. Like, why is that like that?
So far, it's been 3 out of 4. Like the hit rate of that has not been looking good for the U.S.
Then it will be 4 out of 5.
It's gonna be a while before. Yeah.
It's not gonna balance. I don't think it ever
get back to
balances out.
Quincy here.
It's not gonna balance out. Bounce out until.
We gotta get to the 1900s.
Probably like Chester A. Arthur is like when it will start balancing out.
Okay, we have to keep track of that now because I actually want to know.
No, we should. I think it might be like just 2. Yeah, don't forget the Virginia dynasty dominated. Virginia and the South dominated presidencies. The good old boy from Quincy.
How many presidents come from Virginia? It was like
6.
7 of them, I think. 6? Okay.
2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 8. Wow, Woodrow Wilson. Wilson
8.
And William Henry Harrison were the 2 I couldn't think of.
All right.
Harrison shouldn't count, but
just remembered a name or number. I didn't know names.
Ooh, it's weird that they had all the slaveholding presidents early on, and then they had Woodrow Wilson, who's well known as the most racist president of the 1900s. Huh?
Where is Buchanan in that list?
I don't know where Buchanan's from.
Who's the other one that you thought was going to be really troublesome? Wasn't he?
Andrew Johnson. But no, James Buchanan's like actually the worst president.
Yeah.
Like I'm pretty sure about that. Can I pre-grade him 1s for everything?
Yeah, sure. I'll write it in there now.
Go over, what?
It's gonna be the easiest one to review.
See, as much as the Jefferson one was a little hard for me, the James Buchanan one will be easier because he is so easy to hate and he has no redeeming qualities.
Yeah. Jefferson still had qualities that were somewhat admirable.
Yeah.
And that's what makes that. So, yeah, I mean, I wonder how much. Because you said that Jefferson was actually teaching him, like he was his mentor.
Yeah.
Is that a fair assumption or fair?
Yeah, he was a protege.
Yeah. So, I mean, I'm curious. He had to have had discussions with Jefferson on this, and I wonder what Jefferson was trying to tell him.
Yeah. So Jefferson tried to get him to go to William and Mary. So he that's how early on Jefferson was involved in his life. We don't have that much relations with that type of discussion or that much documentation between those two.
Yeah.
It's pretty clear where Madison got a lot of his ideas on the institution of slavery and that awkward balance between the two. The difference is Madison had his own thoughts too. Like there are certain stuff that added, I think Jefferson was a paternalist. Mm-hmm. Madison, probably, but probably not. It's more of a gray area.
But you say paternalist? I'm I'm guessing that means that he feels like he has like a fatherly duty to these people, and he's the one who's actually like caring for them, and they wouldn't
Yes.
be able to survive without his help. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. And Madison clearly doesn't believe that because
Yeah.
he's like, well, they can go form their own country. Because
Right.
he just believed if slaves were freed, they would the nation would fall apart. He did opine a little on it, but not enough for me to feel comfortable saying this is exactly what Madison believed would happen.
Right.
But he did believe it would eventually cause a civil war. That's also why he was actually against, and we'll get into this in, like, obviously we're going to talk about him writing the Constitution as it goes into his and it's weird. He wrote the Constitution and then became president, so he like wrote his job description, which is
Right.
kind of cool. Imagine being the Attorney General to Madison. Like, hey, weird. You're advising somebody on the constitutionality of what you do. It's like, sir, I wrote that. Like,
Right.
get out. We're paying you.
Yeah.
And then, but it is funny when we talk about Madison and Jefferson's relationship because Madison actually becomes kind of a closeted Federalist. As he gets, he was the one who had to reverse a lot of stuff Jefferson did, built up a lot of, started building up a lot of the systems that Jefferson didn't like, that are institutions that exist in America today. No, well, Madison never did follow through on his desire to drive infrastructure, like through the bonus bill and stuff like that. There's more stuff to that vote. I don't want to like get too much into it right now, but
Right.
to say that Madison was anti-infrastructure is wrong. It's just that's a misrepresentation. There was other issues sitting there, and the infrastructure eventually got passed. I mean, you saw a rash of canal building. Madison had this view that states should do infrastructure. He got that view like there's no federal land. I know that sounds weird, but there's no like.
If the federal government is paying for your roads and your stuff, then that means it's owning those, and
Yeah.
he didn't believe that should be the case. The
Yeah,
state should own their transportation
Exactly.
infrastructure. Yeah.
Like it's sometimes you'll hear contemporary discussions on this.
Mm-hmm.
Like how many people like if you look at what lands the federal government are in their jurisdiction, like that they're making day-to-day decisions on. How many of those are? How many people live in those lands? It's like, well, it's just D.C. Like if you live in Pennsylvania, the day-to-day stuff you deal with is Pennsylvania, right? Like
Yeah.
now, finishing up Madison's studies that brought him to believe in the things that we just talked about is that first off, he was a genius. He finished the 4-year curriculum at Princeton in just 2 years. Now,
And this is already a very difficult schedule to keep to
Oh, yeah.
graduate from Princeton.
yes, and I want to. There's a little thing that I've seen written. All right, so just so people like don't add us on this yet. So everybody's like, it took him 3 years to graduate Princeton because he went there in 1769 and graduated in 1772. No, he graduated after 2 years, but he stuck around for an extra year to continue some basically extension studies. I guess we would call that grad school. So no, he did graduate early. So I just want to.
He just wanted to get a couple extra classes in before he left.
Yes. So some internet historians have had that wrong, and there's very good data showing that actually there's no primary sources saying it took him 3 years to graduate. They all are 2 years. Like there's zero. Like,
Should be a date on the diploma, right?
yeah, right. And that workload really took a toll on his health. So he started experiencing a huge increase in seizures, and he fell into a pretty bad depression. That's the thing about Madison. Madison put a lot of stress on himself.
Right.
And this is where Dolly helped him a lot too. But yeah, he studied everything from rhetoric to public speaking to political theory to languages to religious studies. He was really had a good knack for math and science, more so than a lot of the founding fathers, despite a lot of founding fathers also being great scientists. And he did have a debate club called the American Whig Society, which is I don't know. I kind of find that funny because the American Whig Society makes it sound like he would have been a Whig, which politically,
Yeah,
is
like
not what he would have
WHIG.
been. Yeah. So it was a debate club, and they would take on different issues. And there was the Cleosophic Club, they were called the Cleosophic Society. They would just debate. They would take different sides on stuff. So he got really good at debating. He was while he wasn't this great speaker, he was a damn good debater, good consensus builder. He was not a Jefferson or an Adams that would try and bash you in by just being more of a stalwart. This man could convince
circles
you.
around you.
Yeah, he was smarter than you, and he could build circles around you, and he loved consensus building. He was a great negotiator. Like, something Madison doesn't, and we'll get to this on the treaty again, because the treaty again gets taught horribly. It gets taught like, it was no winners of the war and all this. It demilitarized the Great Lakes. Which, like, by the way, just for you, Kyle, I do have a whole section that's just on all the battles of the Great Lakes, because the U.S. Army wasn't super great during the War of 1812, because, and in fairness, they were underfunded and mostly relying on militias. The U.S. Navy, though, the U.S. Navy had a show, and they showed up. How good were they? After Detroit fell, the U.S. Navy liberated Detroit because they so thoroughly beat the British ships on on the Great Lakes, that the Brits were like, we gotta leave Detroit, man. We got nothing. We can't even sustain it. How do you beat somebody so bad that their army, inland army, is like, gotta leave? But yeah, so he starts off with
I'll tell you exactly how that works out. Is because you've just cut off their supply lines. How else are you going to get food and ammo and everything else to Detroit?
Yep, exactly.
Yeah.
But my favorite part is they didn't like get starved out. They just were like, wow, that was a bad beat. They just left. So maybe they knew the logistics.
Oh yeah, it's like we're never getting a ship through here again.
Yeah.
Time to go.
It was like actually the only great battles that we won during the War of 1812. I'm being very broad about here, because don't forget the Battle of New Orleans took place after the Treaty of Ghent was signed. Who would have guessed that Jackson would have been a warmonger? What a surprise. But like every time, like Old Ironside, the Battle of Fort McHenry, like the only time like the land troops did a great job was the Navy dudes at Fort McHenry. Good war for the Navy. Like good, solid showing for those guys.
We're going to probably talk a lot more about the War of 1812, but I remember that being like the thing that kind of made America a global power. Yeah. That was the first time we were able to say, look, we can project force.
Yeah, and then I feel like the Navy also was pumped up after the Quasi Wars, being like, oh wait, we're actually dope. So, kind of closing up on his education, because I do think his education was really important to what Madison became. He was certainly he was an intellectual giant among intellectual giants. I think it was probably like him and John Adams really were peers when it comes to just a pure education background. But there's something, because I think this, again, I think humanizing the Founding Fathers is so important, is he took on this intense academic schedule that he had a very intense academic drive. So it wasn't like this was a mismatch. I couldn't really find anything really that his parents were like pushing him really hard or something like that, but he put it on himself. And it's really cool because you can hear him writing about what's happening to him. He'd go through these periods of just crazy anxiety and crazily deep depression. But he started describing these things. He described them throughout his whole life. He called them sudden attacks. And they weren't like his epileptic seizures. They weren't like the TIAs that some people have.
Panic attack.
Yeah. And it would leave him feeling weak, fearful, and really unable to function for what could be long periods of time. And to overcome that and become president, I just think it's amazing.
I would agree with that. I wonder how much of that pressure he put on himself because of the fact that he was unable to go and like help on the farm and like do physical labor and other things like that. It was like kind of like you put this pressure on yourself. Like, I have to be the best student I can be because I can't do anything else.
Yeah, I bet that's what it was, because he did stress his whole life. He put so much stress on himself. Right. So after college, he returns to Montpelier, which, by the way, shout out to the Montpelier crew, just like the Monticello crew, just great data, great history. I love these guys. They do an amazing job preserving history. So he goes back to Montpelier. Doesn't really do anything for a couple of years. He kind of floats around. He didn't really pursue law or business. He really just went into political philosophy, really trying to understand how the Enlightenment thinkers think, understand government. But then 1774 and the Coercive Acts happened. So now you have like this revolution starts brewing, and he starts joining the local revolutionary efforts. And he took his first political role in 1774 in the same year. He was on the Orange County Committee of Safety, which was a revolutionary body that was created to enforce the Continental Association, which was a boycott of British goods. I love that all these revolutionary bodies are called the Committee of Safety. Like,
I know,
that was, right? That was like Napoleon's oligarchy. But yeah, they organized resistance. He became boys with Patrick Henry. Like this is where he starts really meeting with Thomas Jefferson. Like, not just knowing him as like this political influence, but I just love the idea of like little James Madison, who's like this brainiac. Patrick Henry probably loved this dude. Like, oh, this is wicked smart. I don't know why I gave Patrick Henry a super South Boston accent, but like
they all had that accent. You told us.
Oh, that is right. Yeah, so maybe he did sound like that.
You
So like, but you have like Patrick Henry, who's a wild man, great guy to do. Like, we should do like a 10-minute little video on him. But like Patrick Henry is a blast to read about. Just this wild guy, and he probably loved James Madison. He's probably like, this is my buddy. Like, we go, we hang out. He tells me about crazy stuff, and I'm like, hey, what if we invade? What if we go and like attack the British? It's like, well, I mean, yeah, it's a good idea. No, we do it tonight. Let's go fist fight some British dudes. Like, that's Patrick Henry. Love Patrick Henry. He's one of those. He's like, there's too many good stories around the American Revolution. I feel like Patrick Henry kind of gets screwed in how we teach it because we don't just talk about what a legend that dude was. He works in local government. He leaves there in 1776. He's a delegate to the first Revolutionary Convention at 25, so he was very young. Quickly, him and James Monroe and James Madison are very close, like in how the presidencies were very different. James Monroe oversaw more of a international expansion and stuff like not expansion territory, but influence. But they become wicked good friends. Obviously Thomas Jefferson joins them. They start drafting Virginia's Declaration of Rights. And James Madison's like really adamant about this idea of religious freedom. And his advocacy for religious freedom would actually be what pushes him into the White House, because a bunch of Baptists are really, really nervous about the separation of church and state. That term, separation of church and state, comes from a letter, I believe in 1807, between Thomas Jefferson and the Danbury Baptist Church. They vote Madison in because Madison is a religious guy, but he believes very strongly that like that government can never intrude on religious freedoms. I want to make that clear. Some people make it out like Madison had this idea of like pure separation of church and state. No, Madison drafted the Constitution and did compromise on the amendments, and he actually drafted 12 amendments, and they obviously only have 10 for the Bill of Rights. It's freedom from established religion is really what Madison talks about. The idea that government has no right to tell people what they can worship. Not necessarily the separation side of it. Sometimes that becomes a reductionist argument, and I don't think that's fair to Madison.
Oh, so you're saying that he did not believe the state should tell you anything, but if they wanted to support a church, or if there was a church that the government kind of like endorsed, then he didn't have a problem with that necessarily?
I think it would be like, I don't know where James Madison would fall on Ten Commandments in the courtroom.
Yeah, probably wouldn't care so much about
probably
that.
Probably wouldn't care. He would not like the state endorsing a religion or stopping somebody from practicing the religion they want.
Right.
I think if there was like a prayer at a presidential dinner, I think Madison would be for that. But if they were like, you can only practice Anglicanism, like what happened in England, I think Madison would be very against that. And that's actually how the First Amendment kind of reads.
If the Mormons all got together and decided they wanted to form a state in the western half of the United States and sent him a letter, he would say...
He'd probably say no. Yes. Deseret, or however you would. But
was that during his time? Did we actually get that?
No. That's later. Mormonism didn't exist yet.
How old was he during this time period, like in this period of his life?
Wicked young. He's 26 when he gets he's 26, 27 when he's at the Virginia House of Delegates. He is like, so he's 25 when he goes to the first Revolutionary Convention. So he was 25 when he started drafting Virginia's Declaration of Rights. Madison was considerably young. He was some people argue that John Quincy Adams is the last founding father. There's controversy there because he was literally 12 when this was going on. Madison was in his early 20s. He's a lot younger than everybody else. But Madison worked on something called the Council of State, which basically was the center point for domestic. I don't want to say like domestic policy, but the idea of like domestic structure. Mm-hmm. And so he ended up getting to know all the top people in Virginia politically. And that was really the start. So you got to like 1777. That was hard to say. That's when him and Jefferson really, like, the mentor-mentee relationship really evolves. But yeah, and then 1780 he goes to the Continental Congress in Philly. And it's got to remember, he's 29. He's going to Continental Congress, and we're still fighting the Revolutionary War. It hadn't ended yet. Yeah, he becomes like the youngest and honestly one of the most active members. He ends up like hosting not like parties, but like brainstorming sessions and stuff, where people would come and he would just like they would build consensus on stuff. He wasn't Adams or Jefferson. He was just looking for consensus.
What do they call those groups in Congress when they set them aside to go like study like some problem or
like a subcommittee or a committee?
Yeah, it's almost like he was forming those.
Yeah, and he advocated for a strong national government. He actually helped secure funding and supplies for Virginia's contribution of troops, and he developed like a lot of the structures for modern day fiscal policy in the United States. And he's 29. Like, this is awesome. But
this isn't even. Yeah, we haven't gotten to his presidency yet.
No, so as we fast forward, like he hates the Articles of Confederation. He railed against the Articles of Confederation when they were getting drafted. He eventually. He eventually like was okay. I don't want to say okay, but like acknowledged the Articles of Confederation had to happen, but he hates them. He ends up kind of going on this tear and really pushing for a new Continental Congress. He ends up hosting or pushing to host this convention under the Articles of Confederation. Only like 5 states show up. So at it, he's just like, "Hey, let's just screw it. We're doing it. We're making a new constitution." And he starts drafting one. He really early on, and I know we kind of talked a little bit, but he becomes this huge advocate for religious freedom, and that's something we don't talk about Madison. I mean, most people wouldn't say like, "Oh, who's the president that religious freedom came under?" Like, I think most people shrug their shoulders and not know, but it's Madison. It's undoubtedly Madison.
I would have guessed Jefferson for that letter that you mentioned.
Yeah, and Jefferson did have something called like. Actually, he helped draft them, which is funny. But Jefferson had something called the Statutes of Religious Freedom, which got passed in Virginia in 1786. But it didn't really. Again, a lot of people had an issue with Jefferson talking about like moral upstanding. So he ends up having the Constitution Conventions end up happening. Continental Congress. He serves Continental Congress 1780 to 1783. And he hates the Articles of Confederation. He actually wrote like a tryst, I guess you would call it, on it. He's like, you guys aren't allowed to enforce laws. You're not allowed to tax or regulate commerce. This is a disjointed system. So then I accidentally said the Harvard Convention, which is another major issue in Madison's later life, so I do apologize for that. It's the Annapolis Convention. That's when they like, hey, we need to do some urgent reforms to the Articles of Confederation. 5 states send delegates. Everybody's like, this is a joke. Let's start our own Constitution. He begins drafting the Constitution. It's really heavily influenced by the Massachusetts Constitution, which I say all the time. Ends up Jefferson's hugely influential. Adams is hugely influential. Both these guys are out of the country at the time. One in England, one in France. I don't know why I couldn't remember France. So he's just becoming boys with this guy called Gouverneur Morris, which...
Wait, say it again?
Gouverneur Morris, not governor, Gouverneur.
Okay, I thought you were just losing your mind for a second there. Forget how to pronounce an O?
No, so Gouverneur Morris wrote the preamble to the Constitution. He also had a peg leg because he was having an affair with this lady and jumped over it. Yeah.
Okay, I need that name. Gouverneur?
I'll drop it in the chat, but I love this dude. He is straight comedy.
Morris.
I feel like naming your son Governor essentially is setting a high precedent.
Well, that's why he went Gouverneur.
So, Madison, Hamilton, and Gouverneur Morris, all form this like power team. And these are all weird guys. Madison's just like frail dude who's super smart but sick all the time. Hamilton's just like Caribbean financial genius who half the people hate, half the people love, but George Washington loves him.
Wait, Caribbean financial genius or privateer? smuggler.
I just meant like he was from the Caribbean. I don't know if he engaged in privateering.
I'm pretty sure he's like more of a privateer or smuggler, I think is the.
A lot of the founding fathers were smugglers.
Yeah.
And then Gouverneur Morris. So you have this like Hamilton, who's kind of this like pudgy, like loudmouth, who like people want to hate on him, but he's the reason we beat the British because he funded the war and like established the concept of like national debt and be able to build the budget. So it's like you can't really hate him. And then Gouverneur Morris is this like super charismatic man walking around with like a peg leg, yelling and screaming at people. Like, I like Gouverneur Morris a lot. And so there's like three people just like, dude, let's all hang out. And like they're not from it's just very funny. But Madison started pushing through the Virginia Plan, which Madison drafted. And that was basically like the Buy Campbell legislation. The idea of having a Senate and a House. Madison wasn't a huge fan of the Senate being equal representation, but he eventually gave up on it and had the Great Compromise. Now, it's also the Virginia Plan's also where the 3/5 compromise comes in, so obviously there's always some dark history there. I'm never going to gloss over that. I'm always going to be like, we have to talk about the crappy stuff so we don't repeat it.
Yep.
It also had the Electoral College. He was a big fan of Electoral College, so if you ever want to know where that came from, that was Madison. One of my favorite parts about Madison is that we all learned this in school. Like, who inspired the U.S. government? Oh, Montesquieu. Oh, John Locke. The Roman Republic. Yeah, we all know that. Yeah, that's true. Mm-hmm. That's a factual statement. Those are probably the biggest drivers. All right, but I want to talk about a cooler one that Madison points out. George Washington. Basically, Madison looked at Washington and said, Washington won't accept this. It will never pass. Like, they'll never be able to get it in front of people. So, yeah, so he looked at George Washington, leaned on George Washington as not necessarily as an intellectual reviewer of what Madison was writing.
More like a litmus test.
Right? Exactly. Yeah. And Madison was very open, and I think this is why I like Madison, because I think he's kind of blunt. He just said he's the reason this is credible. If he wasn't here, nobody would have any respect for what we're doing.
Right.
I like that George Washington.
Before too.
And I like that, we talk about all these brilliant people. Like, I love reading John Locke. I love reading David Hume, right? Like, I'm not saying I always agree with them, but, like, I love reading them. And we all know the role Jefferson and Hamilton and Adams played in the Constitution. But I think it's cool to be like, well, was George Washington putting pen to paper? No, absolutely not. But the fact he was there was how they're going to sell it to the American people.
Yeah. Yep.
And so kind of closing out Madison before he becomes president, the Constitution drafting ends. He starts drafting the Federalist Papers. He writes 29 of the Federalist Papers alongside Hamilton and John Jay. John Jay, the Forrest Gump of this podcast.
Yes.
He really is turning into the...
I know, yes.
I feel like we keep mentioning him. And he's going to be mentioned a lot more as we go through it.
More treaties that he negotiated?
Yeah, he's just always around.
Maybe he deserves his own little special, too.
I do like John Jay would be a fun one. So he writes these papers, and I told you how him and Patrick Henry were like boys back in Virginia.
Yeah.
So Patrick Henry was a really fierce anti-federalist. So so Madison comes back to Virginia. He's like, yo, guys, new Constitution, what's up? A bunch of dudes from Virginia drafted a lot of this, and I got George Washington with me. And Patrick Henry's like, I don't care. I don't want a centralized government. And they get some pretty heavy debates. But from everything I can find out, they loved each other. They were mean during the debates. Like it was out for blood. But they loved it. They loved each other. So he ends up getting it passed. And I think Patrick Henry played a role in this, but Madison also drafts what would eventually become part of the Bill of Rights. And Patrick Henry's like, oh no, that's a good idea. Part of me doesn't know if Patrick Henry was being so aggressive because Patrick Henry clearly likes the sport of debating.
I think there's some of that. I mean, I got some of that in me. I like to argue.
Oh yeah. So, closing up like before presidency, there's a lot of cool stuff, but we already covered them under the previous presidents, and those guys had most of the influence. He didn't want to run for government at all, so he didn't want to run for Congress. He actually wanted to be like an advisory role, but Thomas Jefferson's like, no, you have to run, and Madison's like, all right, I guess I'll run. I can imagine, like, he's still wicked young at this time.
Yeah.
So he runs for his first election, and his opponent is James Monroe. So his first opponent is the 5th president of the United States. And James Monroe is the opposite of James Madison. I mean, they're similar, like, in a lot of structures, but I mean, like, as a personality, James Monroe is awesome. You would love to have a beer and dinner with James Monroe. He's, like, funny. He's this great public speaker, charismatic figure, like, just this dude who just people love to be around. And he gets a ton of votes, and everybody's like, he's going to win. Like, and that's the thing. But this is 1789. So there's no, like, internet. There's no nothing. Like, you're engaging with you're only winning people over one vote at a time. So, and this really comes to where Madison.
This isn't 1789. You mean 1809, right?
No, 1789. That's when he runs for Congress.
Oh, Congress. Okay.
Yeah,
you're
right. So this is
okay.
Yeah, I was going to say that'd be really
way off.
way off. Like, you take it like a history book, you're like, "Wow, what the hell?" Yeah. So this is him running for Congress. So this is his first national position.
Yeah, gotcha. I gotcha.
And so he's like running, doing all this stuff, and you get James Monroe just cruising, like, people love me, and like, it's not like James Monroe's a cocky guy. He's just like, I'm liked, people like him. He comes from a good family, all that stuff. And so instead, he just starts like Monroe's just like Madison's just writing letters to people, explaining his positions, talking about like all this different stuff, in private meetings. And so they go to the polls, and Madison wins. It wasn't a huge margin of victory, but he wins. And everybody's like, what happened? Like, people thought Monroe was going to win by like 25 points. And the funny part about it is I have some of the research on Monroe, or some of the script for Monroe already drafting. I have a lot of like background research. I really couldn't find if Monroe took this bad. And given everything I've read about Monroe, he probably thought this was hilarious. Like, he probably wasn't happy, but he probably was like, whoa, did I just lose to this, like, sickly guy who's, like, a genius? But him and James Monroe are already friends. Like, they're like, it's not like he's sad. But what happened is that the Baptist communities, which made up a huge portion of Southern Virginia, came out in droves to vote for him. Like, nobody campaigned to them. Nobody really knew how they were going to vote. But because of his views on religious freedom and his opposition to what won them over is that he argued against laws that favored the Anglican Church. And if we have great people who listen to this podcast, you probably have good understanding of history. But if you know history, you know why a Baptist in the late 1700s would not like pro-Anglican laws. So they viewed him as this guy who was voting not against, broader religious interests, but just very specific about not supporting a church, but still giving these ultimate protections to these religious communities to practice as they will. So they'll show up and vote for him. It'd be like the Amish all showed up and voted for one candidate. Right. And wave throws the election. So he does a great job. It's just like, I just know why I love that story, because he gets up. I love Madison. He's initially opposing the Bill of Rights. Suddenly he's like, here's an argument for it. He's always one of those guys, if you can convince him intellectually, he'll change his opinion. He then switches and is like, oh my God, this actually makes sense, this idea of the Bill of Rights, like these individual personal rights. Drafts 12 amendments. He overperformed. Drafts 20% more amendments than he needs. He originally, this is kind of interesting, he did not think the Bill of Rights should have been an amendment. He thought it should be part of the original document.
Yeah, why isn't it?
Because people didn't like the idea of setting a precedent of opening the Constitution. Which, in retrospect, probably a pretty good move. He ends up having a falling out with Alexander Hamilton. They become wicked big rivals.
Really? Huh.
Yeah, because, like, Madison hated the idea of a national bank, and Alexander Hamilton loved it, which is ironic. Madison eventually supported the national bank.
Didn't he start the second bank?
He did, yeah. In 1816, signed it in. But it's always important to remember, like, these aren't like Jefferson-Adams debates. There isn't a hatred to them. These are, like, I guarantee that they were fierce rivals, as I always described. I wouldn't be surprised if Hamilton and Madison, like, got along perfectly fine. Right. They didn't hate, nobody really hated Madison. They just viewed him as this, like, super smart dude that you could have a conversation with. And if you could convince him, he would change his opinion. And it's on you to convince the smartest guy in the room to change his opinion. That's hard.
Yeah, that's probably like a feather in your cap or a challenge that you do with your friends,
But one of my favorite things is that when Hamilton proposed a national bank, there was some support for it. And eventually, again, when it did eventually pass, Madison was still in the House. So Madison just filibustered him. It was like one of the first filibusters in U.S. history. I think it might be the first.
Yeah.
We don't have great records on like early filibusters, by the way. So if somebody has like an earlier record of a filibuster, like, please let me know. I'd actually be really curious about that. So he filibusters Hamilton, and Hamilton got bored, left out the room, and said, "When Madison's, I give the direct quote from Hamilton, when Madison speaks, he reduces ideas to syllogisms that tire my patience." Because again, Madison's just so smart that he just reduces everything down to nothing. He goes on to serve as Secretary of State under Jefferson. He's the dude who goes and buys the Louisiana Purchase. We mentioned last time about the Louisiana Purchase. I kind of left it a little vague because I did want to save this for the Madison episode. But specifically, I mentioned earlier that we mentioned earlier in the Jefferson one that like they just wanted to buy like the port of New Orleans. It just like nobody really knew what the deal was. It was Madison who was the one who was like, I'm just going to agree to it without having time to talk to Jefferson. And because Madison knew Jefferson would trust him, so I do think that was a cool linchpin right there. Then we go back. Then we go on to we'll go on to his presidency and the wars and all the crazy stuff. But this is Madison right up to the doorstep of the White House.
So when was that in 1789? September 22nd, the filibuster you're referring to?
Oh yeah, is it?
Is that when it was? Because that
was the year. Yeah,
that was
I don't know if that's the
documented
date.
in the United States Senate. That's the first mention of one was from Senator William McClay. He wrote in his diary that the design of the Virginians was to talk away the time so that we could not get the bill passed. But it doesn't say who was talking.
Yeah, it was Madison. I don't know if it could have just not. Filibusters will have multiple people.
Yeah.
To make it up.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, it's Madison. It was actually really. I'm happy you found that because like.
Let me actually copy this so we can have a link for it.
Awesome. He's but it was really really cool. Going through like all the stuff trying to find like a real true first filibuster. So I hope that one's it.
It's from the Senate.gov website, so I imagine it is. Yeah.
Is it I'll bring it up. It's a letter, right? Like it's like somebody in a journal writing it.
Yeah, it was written in the senator's diary. Yeah. All right. Well, I think we did get to the end, though, right? You got
We're good.
Points? You get them all? All right.
That was a lot.
That's definitely a good place to end it, though. Join us next week when we start picking apart the policies that define Madison's presidencies. In the meantime, though, please tell us what you think about Madison's character. How does he compare to his predecessors? You can leave us a comment. You can email us at buckstartsherepodcast@gmail.com. You can visit the website at buckstartsherepodcast.com to stay up to date with everything that we've got putting out. And we will see you all next week. Produced by China Shop Productions.